If you look at the landscape of media talking about AI, you'll find an interesting trend. An idea that many AI experts, self-proclaimed and otherwise, are talking about. This is the idea of alignment, which has been thrown around for quite a while now, and is usually discussed with terms like benefit for humanity, or maximization of human flourishing, or some other suitably utilitarian catchphrase.
Are not aligned with human well-being.
We would create an AI that uses this intelligence to learn what we value. And his motivation system is constructed in such a way that it is motivated to pursue our values.
In fact, not aligned with the true objectives of the human race. The second law is a law of humility, if you like.
We looked at all these different image generation models and found a lot of the same thing. Significant representation of whiteness and masculinity.
Now, when you hear something like that for the first time, it might not seem very suspicious. I mean, sure, everybody wants AI to be safe and beneficial to humanity, right? And yeah, of course, we don't want powerful technologies in the hands of terrorists or the mentally ill or whoever else you might want to put in that category. But there's one important thing that these experts leave out completely, which I'm going to assume is due to a lack of perspective rather than straight up malice, although we can discuss that later. What I'm talking about is the risks that come with the hypercentralization of AI, as well as the fundamental flaw in the idea of alignment itself.
It's not about stopping the research. This is not about not building AI. It's about slowing down the public deployment. We can put the onus on the makers of AI rather than on the citizens to prove why they think.
Legislators who really need information to write laws can use these tools to develop new regulation mechanisms or governance for AI as it gets deployed in whiteness and masculinity.
You don't even know what things it can do, and then it's out there, and in some cases, if it's open source, you can't ever pull it back.
You will notice in these clips I just showed you that many of the solutions offered by these experts to the problem of AI alignment is to prevent anyone but the largest and most powerful organizations from having access to it. Whether that organization be a multi-billion-dollar corporation, or a government, or a university, or whatever. The point is that apparently the solution to all the problems with AI is that you're not allowed to have access to these technologies while they do. Now, it's all well and good to worry about how people might misuse certain future technologies. All you have to do is look at the way people use technology now to worry about that. So maybe it makes sense to make sure that what might be the most powerful technology of this century doesn't end up in the wrong hands, right? So we should want our AI models to be aligned properly, and we don't want them to be accessible to just anyone. But there's two major questions with this line of reasoning. First, will the monopolization of a powerful technology by governments and other select organizations really make said technology any safer? Second, what does alignment even mean? Alignment to whom? To what beliefs? To what values? Now let's tackle this one by one. Let's break down the answer to the first question. The primary things we might want to understand to answer this question are: what are the motivations and driving factors for governments and corporations? For corporations, the surface motive is relatively simple: profit. In most countries around the world, there is a fiduciary responsibility for corporate officers to fulfill what are called in law the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. The definitions of such duties are always vague, but usually the thing that the majority of shareholders in a public corporation want is obviously money. Money is usually paid out by these public corporations to its shareholders in the form of dividends, which are a percentage of profits. So of course, it would make sense that the primary objective of a corporation, especially a public one, is to maximize profits. This is not news to you. Any Marxist can tell you this. But there's room here for other motivations than simple financial gain. Imagine for a moment that you're a significant minority shareholder in a large public corporation. This corporation now has a fiduciary responsibility to you and your peers, which is extremely vaguely defined in law, and which entitles you to bring criminal charges against the corporate officers who control this corporation should they do something you didn't tell them to do. In many jurisdictions, including many in the US, the maximum penalty for the corporate officers in question might be decades in prison. So, considering these facts, it might be possible for you to, say, gather your fellow shareholders and agree to a corporate strategy that has nothing to do with profit, and then compel the people who control this company to execute that strategy. Now, I don't claim to know exactly what motivations drive any specific shareholders at any specific corporation, but the point is, there's absolutely no guarantee that this sort of governance structure would result in anything resembling a maximum benefit to humanity. Now let's move on to governments. Would we be safer and more prosperous if governments had a monopoly on AI technology? Let's start off with the basics. What is a government in the first place? Sounds like a question with an obvious answer, but it's not as simple as it might seem initially. The oldest form of government might have been something like a council of elders in a hunter-gatherer tribe who might have made decisions on behalf of the tribe for the benefit of everyone in it. But of course, this isn't what we mean. The earliest forms of what we would consider a government in the modern sense arose around the 5th millennium BC in the city-states and empires of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. According to Plato, who wrote the Republic in around 375 BC, there are 5 basic forms of government, each of which follows, or claims to follow, a specific principle. The first is aristocracy, or rule of the best. The second is democracy, rule of the people. The third, oligarchy, rule of the few. The fourth, timocracy, or rule of the worthy. This one is probably the most unfamiliar, but it's basically just rule of those who own property. And the fifth and most relevant, tyranny. Now you might notice that aristocracy, oligarchy, and timocracy overlap hugely and are often interchangeable in real systems of government. For example, the Roman Republic might have been considered at various points in its history any combination of all three. Pure democracy and pure tyranny, meanwhile, are opposite extremes. Pure democracy is mob rule, or rule of the majority, while tyranny is essentially illegitimate rule by fear. It's implied that tyrants don't have legitimacy because they usurped their positions. Now, Plato's definitions of governments aren't super well defined, or very accurate in many cases, but the overall theme is simple. Government exists in order for those who hold power within its systems to wield that power. Power, as a basic definition, is the ability or the means to compel other people to do what you want them to do against their will. For those who hold this power, the law can become a tool for their own personal ends. Anyone who has a controlling stake in government, therefore, may become a tyrant. So why is this relevant to the discussion about AI alignment? Well, the point is that unless you're directly involved with the power structures of government, there is absolutely no guarantee that government monopolization of AI technology is going to lead to anything other than absolute tyranny. The idea that handing this sort of power to a tiny minority of these power-holding individuals is somehow safer than letting the technology spread organically simply because they're members of the government is frankly complete nonsense. What is alignment? Fundamentally, the term alignment with regards to AI is usually a vaguely defined endorsement of utilitarianism with some subtle authoritarian undertones. In case you don't know what utilitarianism is, let's go over the basics. The concept of utilitarianism originates in the late 18th and early 19th centuries out of the classical English liberal tradition. The man most often cited to be the founder of this philosophy is Jeremy Bentham. Now, Big Jeremy here said that the fundamental axiom of utilitarianism is the idea that it's the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. Essentially, the goal is to maximize the well-being and happiness of as many people as possible. On the face of it, a noble aspiration if I've ever seen one. But there's a big question here that I don't think anyone has answered, especially with regards to this whole AI alignment thing. Who or what decides what well-being and happiness is for the maximum number of people? At first glance, this might not seem like that important of a question, because of course we all know what well-being and happiness are, right? Well, not so fast. In the first place, well-being and happiness are highly subjective. Something that I might consider conducive to my own happiness and well-being might not be the same for you. In fact, for certain subsets of people, the thing that would maximize their own happiness might be the maximization of misery and suffering for certain other people. And this, in my opinion, is the great lie that underpins the concept of AI alignment. The idea that any technological system, let alone an intelligent machine, could be perfectly aligned to represent the interests of the entirety of mankind is laughable. Obviously, humans aren't even aligned to each other in any sense of the word. All you have to do is take a quick look on social media to see what I'm saying is obviously true. So what do all these AI companies and their founders and CEOs actually mean when they say that they're in favor of alignment? Clearly, we know what they're proposing isn't actually possible. And before anyone tries to say otherwise, they almost certainly know that what they're saying isn't possible. They're not stupid. So there's a couple of cases here. Either they truly aspire to align their intelligent machines with humanity as best as they possibly can, at their own expense, and with essentially zero chance of success. Or they're talking about something else entirely. Let's break down the evidence for each case. Take, for example, the actions of OpenAI and its leaders, who are arguably some of the most important players in the industry right now. When OpenAI was founded in 2015, Ilya Sutskever and Greg Brockman said, and I quote, "Our goal is to advance digital intelligence in the way that is most likely to benefit humanity as a whole, unconstrained by the need to generate financial return. It will be important to have a leading research institution which can prioritize a good outcome for all over its own self-interest." Now, I'd like to note the vague utopian wording here, which implies a commitment to open source and generally open attitude towards the release of tools and models. I mean, if your goal is to benefit humanity as a whole, open sourcing is the natural thing to do, since benefit is obviously something that only each individual can decide for himself and his loved ones. Credit where credit is due. OpenAI did, in fact, make good on this statement for the first few years of the company's existence. They did open source a lot of their tools and models. But as we now know, they no longer open source any of their tools or models. In fact, they don't even release model weights or anything really. In fact, if you look at their announcements now, they completely omit any technical details as well, so that nobody else can get anything useful out of it. So given this change in stance, maybe they weren't implying that they were committed to open source. Well, the problem is, if that's not what OpenAI was implying there, then it implies that they think they have the ability, or worse, the right, to represent the interests of every human being that currently exists and will exist in the future. Well, then you might say, surely they're not so arrogant. Maybe that statement doesn't really mean what it means at face value. The only other alternative then is that this statement was deliberately constructed as a lie, and the founders of OpenAI aimed from the beginning to selfishly take control of the immense power that AGI would give them for their own purposes, whatever those may be, while taking advantage of the financial benefits of being a non-profit and having a cool mission statement to attract researchers. Either way, I'm just saying that there's a very good reason to be skeptical of their motives, and that when they talk about alignment, we have to take into account all of this context. But let's go on a trip to the past for a moment. Fast forwarding to the period between the middle of 2018 and around early 2019. Ancient history in the AI space, but only about 5 years ago as of the publishing of this video. This was a flashpoint in the history of OpenAI. Up until this point, they'd more or less been making good on their mission statement to benefit humanity as a whole. They'd made a good number of their tools and models freely available to the public. Some of you may remember that GPT-1 and GPT-2 were actually open source. You can still find the source code on GitHub now, and the pre-trained weights are even available on Hugging Face. But something happened here during this particular point in time that changed their minds about what benefit to humanity as a whole actually meant to them. The release of the Transformer family of models, which by the way OpenAI didn't contribute anything to creating, represents a fundamental shift in the capabilities of intelligent machines which hadn't been seen previously. After GPT-2, OpenAI seems to have realized that future models, specifically GPT-3 and GPT-4, would have capabilities that would make AGI seem closer to reality than ever before. You have to realize that before this, the most advanced natural language systems couldn't hold a conversation at anything resembling a human level. And the transformer architecture itself was originally designed purely as a foreign language translation tool. OpenAI were likely just as surprised as everyone else when their GPT models started to write poems and essays. Once they realized this, how much money and power GPT models might be able to give them. Their entire mission seems to have lost a bit of relevance for them. In early 2019, they created a subsidiary called OpenAI LP, which they call a capped profit company. If you look on their website, they have this nice little pink box that says their for-profit company exists to advance OpenAI Inc.'s mission of ensuring that safe artificial intelligence is developed and benefits all of humanity. And you know, maybe they aren't lying. Maybe they really are just trying to benefit all of us, and in order to do that, they need more money. Fair enough. But let's see how they acted in the following years. In 2020, their first really successful large language model, GPT-3, was announced. Now, unlike GPT-1 and GPT-2, GPT-3 was completely closed source, and the weights were kept under lock and key. Not a great start. Then, as we know, GPT-3 was eventually released for public use, but not open source, through their web application. They began to charge money for the use of their models. More recently, they announced a state-of-the-art video generation model, which the public can't even use, by the way, much less having access to the source code or the model weights, as well as potentially other models that they're working on behind the scenes, like Q-Star, which they're even more secretive about than Sora. So let's summarize for a moment what happened here. OpenAI, whose founders claim to believe in the principle of benefit to all of humanity, begins in 2015. They begin operations, and their stuff isn't really amazing, you know, not quite state of the art, but still interesting work, like what they did with OpenAI Gym. They open source all of their tools and models because that's what benefit to all of humanity would actually mean for an AI research company. In 2019, they find out that this new model type that not many people are really using might be way closer to AGI than anyone originally thought. By 2020, their models have begun to make conversation at a human level, and they're astonished. There's two general routes they might have taken in their thinking at this point. The first is, what would happen if the plebs got their hands on technology like this? And of course, this stuff is only going to keep getting better as time goes on, so who knows what people might do if these models were released into the wild. We need to keep it under our exclusive control so bad things don't happen. The second is, and this is the more sinister one, we can't let anyone else have this technology because what we intended to do all along was to control AGI for ourselves, for our own ends. Now, I don't claim to know exactly what Sam Altman or Ilya Sutskever were thinking when they made the decision to begin monopolizing their technology, but take a look at this clip.
To you at the time, what does it mean to you now?
I would definitely pick a different, speaking of going back with an oracle, I'd pick a different name. Open source or not, yeah, I think we should open source some stuff and not other stuff.
Precedent that sets for other startups. Is that something?
I would heavily discourage any startup that was thinking about starting as a nonprofit and adding like a for-profit arm later. I'd heavily discourage them from doing that. I don't think we'll set a precedent here.
Okay, so most startups should go just...
For sure.
So
and again, if we knew what was going to happen, we would have done that too.
I mean, how much clearer can it get than that? If they knew that their models were going to be as powerful as they are, they would have started out as a regular for-profit so that they would have had complete control over their technology. Of course, if they had, then they wouldn't have been able to attract the best researchers and engineers in the field, and they wouldn't have been able to claim that they had a noble mission statement, and they would have had to pay taxes. Basically, they wouldn't be in the dominant position they're in now if they weren't non-profit. Isn't that convenient for Big Sam here? And this line also implies, of course, that at least one of the founders of OpenAI, namely Sam, didn't actually care about benefit to all of humanity in the first place. Because he says himself that the non-profit nature of OpenAI, literally the central mechanism for creating this benefit to all humanity, only applied, apparently, if he didn't know where they were going to be now. Either way though, there's a solution to this problem, which I'm going to propose, one that to some might seem less than ideal. But considering the integration of any technology into society is always going to be less than ideal, I think this solution is the only one that's actually viable. That solution is essentially to open source, or at the very least, allow open access for AI tools and models. As we've already discussed, the idea that monopolizing this power in the hands of a tiny number of bureaucrats is going to lead to more safety or more benefit for you or me is absolute nonsense. In fact, it probably increases the inherent risks. Open sourcing AI would allow anyone to get their hands on a very powerful technology. But that's exactly why it'll actually be safer in the long run. The reason for this is simple. Yes, bad actors might be able to use it to create all sorts of mayhem, but it will also open the door for enterprising individuals to create models that would be better and safer than any bureaucrat could ever dream of for the actual benefit of all humanity. And that really is the only way to align AI.